بشنو این نی چون شکایت می کند از جدایی ها حکایت می کند. Behold this nay how she laments, of separations she narrates. Salam and good evening everyone. Sorry I'm running a bit energetic because I was doing everything. It's so fun. And as Pia so warmly said, it's Nowruz in 8 hours and happy spring equinox to everyone. And I am so happy to be doing this lecture here tonight, which is called Sufism and Alchemy, Allegorical Storytelling as the Vehicle for Esoteric Wisdom. So first and foremost, I have to say my name is Safa Mir, and I am a transdisciplinary artist, researcher, and tarologist. That is a fancy word for a tarot reader. And I owe my practice of deciphering the imagery, the symbolic imagery of the tarot, and also translating in a performative way the poetry, the Persian poetry of Rumi and Hafiz, to the experiences that I've had at this beautiful building, the Embassy of the Free Mind. It is such an honor to be able to give this lecture here. I have gained all of the wisdom that I'm about to partake onto you and also my profession through the experiences and the people that I met here. So what is about this library that is so amazing and has helped me a lot in my journey as an artist and a researcher? And that is the study of esotericism. Esotericism is a new field of study in academia which tries to look at these traditions and practices of all around the world which are kind of occult and behind a certain veil. This building and the people who come here and the history of the Hermetic philosophy program at University of Amsterdam, they are trying to decipher and decode the meanings, the secret teachings of these traditions through various methodologies of history, of reading texts, of finding out the letters, the bibliography of these texts, to try to kind of like a detective work understand what these spiritual practices or religious practices meant for the practitioners and if they can mean something for us now today. So I have used this methodology to understand the two aspects of my life, which is the tarot and the Sufi Persian poetry, because they kind of have something in common, which is they use symbolic language to talk about something in a discrete way. And using the methodologies of esotericism, I've been able to create this method of using tarot and also being able to understand what this symbolic Sufi Persian poetry is about so that I can translate it in another language or in a performative way. So that brings us all to tonight, that what I'm going to talk about tonight, which is one aspect of this esoteric practice, which is the use of allegorical storytelling. So the first thing that comes to mind when we're talking about esotericism is, why is it hidden then? Why is it esoteric? So first we can look at Hermes Trismegistus and his Corpus Hermeticum, in which he talks about 5 reasons to keep silent and keep these teachings and traditions hidden. And these 5 are: profane minds pollute holy matters. Profane means someone who does not understand or is not yet ready to understand these teachings. So at first, when people come in and they have no idea, if you partake them this wisdom, they will pollute these holy divine matters. And secondly, we have profane minds shall do greater evil by this knowledge, because they have not been part of the tradition. So of course, they're going to do something that is not very well with it. So you have to first be part of the tradition in order to be worthy of understanding this. Otherwise, you will do evil, more evil. Silence allows the flow of divine enlightenment. This is obvious and everybody can understand. Through meditation, you can understand something. That's just one scratch of what it can mean. And to utter the ineffable is futile. There are many things that is difficult to explain. I'm sure I hope you've all been in love, and how ineffable it is to be able to tell someone what you feel about them. Now imagine talking about God. Of course, it cannot be done. And finally, which is against translation, the words themselves are holy. If you read something in Hebrew or in Arabic or in Greek, or in Egyptian that Hermes Trismegistus was originally from, if you were to translate these teachings into another language, you would actually profane the words themselves, so you should have kept silent. But I did not do that, and I'm going to translate everything. So this is from the Western esoteric traditions, the reasons for keeping silent. But in the Eastern, or more accurately, the Sufi tradition, the reason for silent is something else, and it's called khamoosh, or hush. And this is, of course, so big and so huge. I'm not going to get into it that much, but the main thing is really beautifully described by Sheikh Mahmoud Shabestari in his beautiful work, Rose Garden of Secrets, Gulshan Raz, in which when he is talking about how truth has different facets and different versions of itself, and no one person can understand the entirety of truth, and the best that we can do is project our understandings into the truth so that we can get a grasp of it. And through that, he says, از او هرچه بگویند از کم و بیش نشانی دادند از دیده خویش. Of it, what they say, whether less or more, merely signifies that which they behold. So whatever you say about it, which is the divine presence, you're just saying what you're seeing at best, if you're not lying and if you're not trying to deceive people. You're seeing what you see, but other people see other things. So the only thing that is sensible and can make sense is that if you keep silent and you keep that experience to yourself. That's why when we are reading Persian poetry or Sufi poetry in general, they always end with the silence. They say, I said enough. This was just enough of me, my objective reality to you. The rest is up to you. But this is inside the tradition and the reasons that they give to keep silent. But there is a more broader reason for keeping silent, and that is persecution for heresy. This is something that we are all so familiar, and it was the norm until about 100 years ago, that if you say weird things that are not orthodox or they go against the norms of the society, you will be persecuted and punished in the most horrible way. We have it, the Inquisition in Europe and all of the history that you are aware of. And in Sufi practice specifically, we have the character of Mansur Hallaj, which has become the symbol of the act of uttering something that you should not have said, and he was executed. What he said was, An al-Haq, I am the truth, I am God, I am God. And that concept, okay, it's something else, I'm not going to get into it that much, but he was persecuted, and of course he was tortured and beheaded and all of that. And through all of that process, he continued saying, I am God, because he said, I believe it to be true, and I am going to be reunited with my beloved. So get on with it. Do it faster, please. Out of these reasons for heresy, even though all of these things are happening and they're trying to communicate these teachings and understandings that they had in their traditions, they come up with a way of communicating and preserving this knowledge, and that is symbolic representation. And it spans around all over the globe, different ways of preserving and communicating these secret teachings in artistic expressions. We have architecture, and in Islam especially, because drawing imagery is forbidden, but in architecture is allowed. And also we have in Western traditions, Freemasons were literal architects, and they would convey their teachings in the buildings that they would create. And of course we have literature, the most thing that we are familiar with, and this is a library of these teachings. And we have performance in Sufism. We have the whirling dervishes, the way that they would convey their teachings or let you understand what they are experiencing through joining them in this practice. And in the Western tradition, we have ceremonial magic that you perform. And finally, we have visual arts. We have it all around us. And in Persian poetry is done in calligraphy, which conveys that information as well. And one interesting thing about all of these different forms of symbolic representation is that they somehow manifest in alchemy. Alchemy has all of these different forms. We have architecture or sculpture. They would create laboratories and devices for their alchemical processes. We have literature in which they would talk about what the alchemical process meant in a symbolic way, and they had performances. The whole process of doing the alchemical process throughout its progression always was believed to be a spiritual practice, that it elevates your soul through that performative act of actually doing the work. And finally, we have visual arts again all around us. The alchemy being this beautiful combination of having all of these representational arts as a way to convey these spiritual or esoteric messages is something that is seen in both Islamic traditions of Sufism and also in the Western esoteric traditions. Before continuing, I'm just going to mention a bit about various sides of alchemy that this research could have gone further into, but we don't have time. One is the scientific version of what is the history of the development of alchemy when it started in Egypt and then went to Hellenistic Greek and then Islamic world and then Europe, and then it turned into chemistry and then it turned into metallurgy, and finally, it became the science that we know of today. And the other version is the Islamic alchemy, which is the comprehensive understanding of the cosmos, which they try to translate the teachings of Islam and combine them with the understandings that they got from the translations of Greek texts of Aristotle and all these other natural philosophers, and they created this cosmological understanding of the world in the language of alchemy, and that was the thing that was transferred into Europe and continued as the alchemy that we know in the Western esoteric traditions. And finally, the one that you're all mostly familiar with is spiritual alchemy, which is the practical pursuit of inward and physical transmutation, in which the actual act of trying to transmute copper or lead into gold actually transmutes your soul into a divine soul, or actually heals your body in that practice, which is a bit proven to be not true in the history of alchemy. They were not trying to do that. It was something that was added to alchemy around in the 17th century and more toward the 20th century, which leads to psychological alchemy, which is the symbolic quest for spiritual enlightenment, which was something that was kind of hypothesized by psychologists like Eliade and also Jung, who said this alchemical process that they were trying to do is actually a way of elevating their souls, which of course was not true. They were looking from a mythological and symbolic perspective into the world, into these works. But these are things that other people have worked a lot on, and this presentation is not going to get into. What we're going to get into is alchemy as allegory. We are just going to see what these artists, who were not alchemists themselves, but they used the jargon and the symbology and the imagery of alchemy to convey their messages. Here we have basically the starting point of alchemy, which is Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus. And this is my own translation. The above is from the below, and the below is from the above. Wondrous work is from a single thing, in the same way that all things are from a single arrangement. This little sentence has inspired alchemists and esoterists and philosophers and spiritualists all throughout the ages for about 1,000 years, and we still don't know what it means. But it has inspired us to create all of these different things. And I think at least 20% of the pictures in this room have elements from these words in them. So when we're going to talk about alchemy as allegory, tonight I'm going to focus on two works: the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosicrucians and the Masnavi Ma'navi, or spiritual verses of Rumi. These two are kind of examples of the Western esoteric traditions and the Middle Eastern or Islamic esoteric traditions, are going to show how these two different practices used allegorical storytelling and alchemical imagery to talk about their practices and their ideas and their beliefs. And of course, I chose the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosicrucians because of the whole theme of the night. And I'm just going to go really fast through the whole thing about the chemical wedding. I assume that most of you know what it is, but I'm just gonna bear with me, please. Just a quick historic run-through of who were the Rosicrucians, a reformist movement that started at the beginning of the 17th century by the publication of these three manifestos: Fama Fraternatis, Confessio Fraternatis, and the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz. Fama means fame of the fraternity, but Peter Forshaw today taught me that rumor is a better word because nobody knew about them and then they just came around. So I'm going to use that. And basically these three manifestos were calling on a reform of society in religious sense, in political sense, in physical sense, in all the different senses that was believed to be possible. And they published these discrete manifestos in order to talk about what kind of reform they believe is right for society. And they kind of created this vision of having this brotherhood that is hidden and you can join to understand their wisdom as well. In the Fama, they talk about the history of their fraternity, which was created by Christian Rosenkreuz, who was believed to not have existed, and it was a fabrication of the creators of these manifestos, and how he traveled the world, learned all the knowledge of that time, and then created this fraternity with hopes of bringing wisdom and healing to all. And in the Confessions, they talk about what is their goal, what is their ideologies, basically. What is it that they want to convey? They talked about the importance of Protestant ideologies. They talk about the importance of alchemy. They talk about the importance of healing the poor and healing the sick and helping the poor and not being that earthly oriented. And finally, we have the Chemical Wedding, which is completely different from these two, and I will get to it in a bit. But before that, we have to talk about who were the people who wrote these texts. And all three texts were written by Johann Valentin André. And it tells a lot about what the Rosicrucians were actually trying to convey if we look at his life and what influenced him. That's what a study of esotericism does. He was a member of the Protestant Utopian movement. His father was an alchemist. His grandfather was among Martin Luther's original supporters, and he himself was a pastor most of his life. And all of them combined show that he had a lot of Protestant, reformist, utopian, Lutheran ideologies, and he had a great knowledge of alchemy and the language and the jargon and the symbology of alchemy. And he used all of this knowledge to create the manifestos and the Chemical Wedding in order to convey his vision of the right society or utopian society. Of course, years later, he denounced all of that and he said it was not okay. I didn't like that. They were not fun. But the influence of this work persists to this day, and we are experiencing that. And the influence and the inspiration that these texts brought out has created all of these different branches and different orders. And the tradition of Rosenkreuz, or that idea of Christian Rosenkreuz as a figure of combining the wisdoms from the world, persists and lives on today. So now let's get into the Chemical Wedding. This is the hardest part of the evening for me, because this text is such a huge thing to read and to understand. It might take years, and not much work has been done on it, unfortunately. Basically, it is an allegorical tale about Christian Rosenkreuz as his olden days. And one night he is in his chambers and he is met, or he is visited by this angel who invites him to the wedding of the king and queen. And he goes on this journey into the castle of the king. A lot of things happen there. There are a lot of trials. There are a lot of different characters that he meets. It's filled with riddles and allegorical imagery and play within play. And finally, after all of that, the whole wedding becomes an alchemical process in and of itself, where the bride and the groom are created through that alchemical process. And then finally the marriage happens and everybody goes home except Christian Rosenkreuz, because he becomes the gatekeeper of that castle because of the profane act that he did. And I'm not going to spoil that. So this whole book has been a topic of debate over the years of what it means and what it tries to convey. We've had different approaches that people had. There were some people who tried to look at it actually alchemically and do the things that the book is trying to say. There are people who look at it as an allegory of the spiritual practice, but in all probability, we will never actually understand what is going on unless you do the work that the Rosicrucians were trying for you to do. But the main thing that I'm going to focus on here is the use of alchemy, different birds, different animals, the lion, all of that in conveying the mysteries of the Rosicrucians. And this allegorical tale in and of itself, I argue myself, that was the influence of Rosicrucianism that was created later as a spiritual practice that developed. The secrecy and the symbolic imagery of this text influenced people to project their understandings onto it and create meaning and practices and understandings out of it. So now the hard part is done. I'm happy. Now we go to the part that you all came here for. Alchemy in Sufism. In Sufism, it's a bit different than what we see here or what we experience in the Western traditions. In Sufism, they use alchemy in a really simple way. They just use the concept of copper turning into gold with the help of the philosopher's stone. And they actually call this philosopher's stone kimia, the alchemy. The elixir that came out was called kimia. And this was something that the Sufis were really good at. They would just take some random thing from society and turn it into a spiritual saying. They would do this with everything. When I'm talking about Masnavi a bit further, I will give you another example that is a bit weird. But in general, Sufis in their poetic expression of the experiences that they were having, they would use all these different jargons. They would use the jargon of philosophy, they would use the jargon of different languages, they would use sports, they would use chess, they would use playing cards, all of these things to convey the spiritual practices that they were doing. And actually, the better you were at it, the more famous poet you would have become. And here I have a line from Saadi Shirazi, which actually shows the entirety of the use of alchemy in Sufi poetry. گویند روی سرخ تو سعدی که زرد کرد اکسیر عشق بر مسم افتاد و زر شدم. Saadi, they ask, who turned your ruby red cheeks piss poor yellow? The elixir of love devoured my copper and I became gold. I might add to this that having red cheeks means that you're eating well, you're healthy, everything is good. But if you have yellow face, it means that you're not healthy, you're sick, you're not eating well. And they believed, as you know of Sufis, they were ascetics, and they believed that if you're healthy and good and everything is fine, you are attached to the earth and you are not ready to be one with God and transcend to beyond. So if you were poor and if you were thin and if you were dying, it was a good sign. And, and they changed this imagery into the copper of your face, the copper which is red, is going to become yellow because of the pain and the suffering that you do on the path, so that it becomes gold and you are ready to be with God. And this is the general vision of how Sufis would use alchemy. But I'm going to go a bit specific and talk about a certain aspect that Rumi does in his work and the way that he uses alchemy, which can be a beautiful way to explain what Sufism is trying to do. So before that, I'm just going to quickly say who Rumi was. Jalaluddin Muhammad Balkhi, known as Rumi, is the most renowned Persian Sufi mystic and poet, and one of the biggest figures in Islamic mysticism and also everywhere. Everybody knows Rumi. I love that. He was born in Balkh, nowadays Afghanistan, and because of the invasion of the Mongols, he migrated with his family to Konya, nowadays Turkey, and there he had all of these different experiences and became one of the greatest Sufi poets, and he created the Mevlevi Sufi order, which persists to this day. His teachings has influenced Sufism forever, and he has created this huge body of work that still not much work on it has been done. But I'm going to talk a little about his version of Sufism, because Sufism is such a vast concept. We have Sufism of the Indian, Sufism of Iran, Sufism of West Iran, East Iran, Sufism of Iraq, and then we have this African Sufism, and of course we have the Western Sufism that is happening right now, and they are all different. But Rumi's is based on these three concepts that a Sufi must uphold in order to become one with God. We have Shari'ah, or Islamic law. We have Tarīqah, which is the Sufi wayfaring. Tarīqah means to keep going and keep going to the path. And then Haqīqah, which means the truth. Shari'ah is the Islamic law, and it's a scary word, and as an Iranian, we haven't had much fun with Sharia, but it talks about the basic of Islam. And when Sufis are talking about Sharia, means that they are not someone who is trying to get away from the heterodox Islam. They are doing everything that a normal Muslim does. They just want to do something a bit extra. And that is Tarīqah, the Sufi wayfaring, which means walking the path of loving God until you become one with God. And everything happens between this Tarīqah, which is really difficult, and that's exactly the esoteric part of Sufism, because you don't know what happens. The main thing that you know what happens is you have a teacher, and the teacher tells you what to do. But to give you some idea, basically what the idea of Tarīqah is to annihilate and kill your ego, to not have a nafs or a self, to be nobody. And the way that it happens is someone did it, and that someone is actually the Prophet Muhammad, but it's debatable who actually started it. But somebody annihilated their ego, and when you annihilate your ego, you see the ego of people so easily. You understand what is it about them. You see it in their clothes, the way that they put makeup. What is it about them that makes them them? And a Sufi master would look at you and be like, okay, you have to cut your hair, and you have to change your pants, and you have to cut away your ties with your family, and you have to kill your children, and you have to, not that intense, no, sorry. But you get the idea. He was so intense, the Sufi master, that you had to, the only way that you could accept him and do what he says was because you loved him. And the moment that you would choose to do what the Sufi master says and do the thing that goes against your ego would go away, and then you would see the tariq, the Haqīqah, or the truth. And that would connect your soul with the Sufi master a bit more. And then you would be like, wow, this was amazing, I want to do it again. And this time says, now you have to do something even worse, even more difficult, and kill a bigger part of your ego. And you would be like, are you kidding me? This is so hard. That's why it was a wayfaring, because it's a path, and you keep going and you keep going until you actually die. So I explained it, but now I'm going to try to explain it the way that Rumi did in Spiritual Verses. Spiritual Verses is this massive, beautiful book written by Rumi. It's actually 6 books, you can see them. I've been trying to read it. It's been 4 years. Wish me luck. I will finish it in 2 more years. And the way that it's structured is really close to the Quran or the Bible or the Torah. It's story after story after story after story. And these stories are all filled with these allegorical themes. And all of the teachings of Rumi is inside these stories. And this book is actually designed, or he wrote it in a way that if you read it from start to the end, you're actually traversing the Tarīqah. And if you listen to the things that he's saying and you take him as a sheikh, you will go from Shari'ah to Tarīqah to Haqīqah. And it's exemplified in this verse. از مقامات تبتل تا فنا پایه پایه تا ملاقات خدا. from the stations of abstinence to annihilation, step by step, till God's embrace be the culmination. It's a really difficult book to explain, but thankfully Professor Alan Williams made this beautiful chart to talk about the framework of Rumi's principal voices, of how Rumi talks in the spiritual verses, Masnavi, Ma'navi, to kind of grab a hold of your soul and whirl it around inside this path over and over and over again. And the way that it works is something like this. First, you have Rumi as an authorial figure. Talks, says, hi, hello, I'm Rumi, I'm going to tell you this story, and this story is going to be really good for you, so listen to me. And then he starts telling a story, like some random story about some random thing, and it's not that important. But sometimes it's really important. It's a story from the Bible, or a story from the Quran, or a story from the hadith of the Prophet. And then after that, there are some people inside the story who are talking as well. So we have the dialogue phase of the story where different characters of the story are talking. And so far, you can see there are different voices talking in this story, in this storytelling. And you are reading this story and you're seeing yourself as all these different characters. You see yourself as Rumi, you see yourself as the storyteller, and you see yourself as the different characters. And inside that, he also gives more analogies about what he's talking about. He just puts the story on hold and talks about, this is also reminding me of this other thing. And now you have to understand what that other thing is. But they're all about the same thing. And when you are so inside the story, he brings about the moral questionings of what this story is trying to say. He tells you, this is why you should do this, and that is why you should be doing that. And through the moral teachings comes about the spiritual teachings. And he says, so if you do this, like this character in this story, and this other version that it can be, you will be able to reach Haqīqah, or the truth. And he talks about the spiritual essence of what it means to see the truth, what it means to be the gold, what it means to reach God. And then when he reaches that state, when he's talking about that, he stops himself and he goes, hush, I shouldn't say more about this. Let's go back to this story. And he continues the narrative again from another narrative and another narrative. And it takes you in this whirlpool of story after story, allegory after allegory, where you're trying to figure out what it's talking about and what he's trying to say. And through this symbolic interpretation of your soul and your life and the stories, you traverse the path from Sharīʿah to Tarīqah and finally in Haqīqah. Now, to finish, I am going to read the part in spiritual verses that actually inspired me to create this, this presentation. And it is actually not the poetry of Masnavi, it's actually the introduction to book 5. It's in prose, the introduction, he talks about it in prose. And it's really a raw use of alchemy and how he uses alchemy to convey what he's talking about. And based on everything that I have said tonight, I hope you can follow along and I don't need to explain much more and we can just read. This is the 5th book of the poem in rhymed couplets and the spiritual exposition setting forth that the religious law is like a candle showing the way. Unless you gain possessions of the candle, there is no wayfaring. And when you have come unto the way, your wayfaring is the path. And when you have reached the journey's end, that is the truth. Hence, it has been said, if the truths were manifest, the religious law would be naught. So what he's saying, the first step in Sufism is that you learn what Islam is saying, that you pray 5 times a day, that you fast during Ramadan, that you do all these things. That would be the candle that shows you the way. The same is with esoteric practices in the West, where Christianity was the main thing. and the love of Christ becomes the main thing that they're all trying to reach. And what happens later is something that goes into the esoteric sense. This is also what Rumi is saying. The candle is the religious law. And unless you have a candle, there is no wayfaring. You cannot get on the path. And then when you are on the path and you reach the end of the journey, which is the truth, you don't need the religious law anymore, which was super controversial, but that's for another day. As for example, when copper becomes gold, or was gold originally, it does not need the alchemy, which is the law, nor need it rub itself upon the elixir, which is the path. For, as has been said, it is unseemly to demand a guide after arrival at the goal, and blameworthy to discard the guide before arrival at the goal. In short, the law is like learning the theory of alchemy from a teacher or a book, and the path is making use of chemicals and rubbing the copper upon the elixir, and the truth is the transmutation of the copper into gold. So he here starts to use alchemy to talk about what he means. He says, alchemy is the Sharīʿah, is the thing that is going to help you along the way. And you are the copper who wants to become gold. But after the copper is turned to gold, or if it was gold from the beginning, it doesn't need the alchemy anymore. So if you try to learn alchemy, you are trying to learn how to reach the truth. But if you reach the truth, you don't need to learn alchemy anymore. Those who know alchemy rejoice in their knowledge of it, saying, "We know the theory of this science." And those who practice it rejoice in their practice of it, saying, "We perform wondrous works." And those who have experienced the truth rejoice in the truth, saying, "We have become gold and are delivered from the theory and practice of alchemy. We are God's freed men." Each party is rejoicing in what they have. So here you see it goes back to the fact that still none of them will know the truth. The only person who knows the truth is the person who's dead. Even if you reach truth, if you reach Haqīqah, you are still part of this earthly realm. And that's, again, another part of the story. But what happens here, what he tries to show in this verse, is that this book is going to show you the alchemical process of transmutating your copper into gold. But it's something that first you must learn from a teacher, then do as a practitioner, and then when you are, then you don't need it anymore. And this process of Sharīʿah, Tarīqah, and Haqīqah becomes the experience that the alchemists and the Sufis and other esoteric practitioners have been trying to achieve. Before finish, I want to say something which is a bit controversial, I don't know what to call it. Although I have been using the methodology of esotericism to bring about this lecture, the experiences that I've been having with reading these texts have been quite different. And I think that is the most important thing that is kind of neglected in esoteric practice and also academia, which is what does reading these alchemical books do to you, to each of us? I've had crazy experiences reading The Chemical Wedding. I've had crazy experiences reading Rumi every day, every moment of it. And the experiences that I've had with my body can never be used in scholarship of understanding what these practices are trying to do. And that is what I want to bring to the table as an artist, as a researcher, and as a tarologist, and that is the need for a practitioner scholarship research, establishing a conceptual groundwork on how to bridge the gap between practitioner and scholarship in a methodologically sound manner for the co-production of knowledge in the study of esotericism. what we practitioners experience can be turned into sound, usable data for scholarships to understand how these practices work. We can use the texts that were written thousands of years ago or hundreds of years ago, but they would still, what we can do with that knowledge could only be the knowers, the teachers of alchemy. But if we want to understand what the alchemical process does, we have to be able to transcribe the practice of alchemy, of magic, of astrology, and of Sufism. And with them, combining them together, we might at some point reach truth or Haqīqah. Thank you very much.